Hi everyone. So what I'm going to be talking about today is about the growth and increasing permanence of charitable food aid in the UK. And so what I mean by charitable food aid, you'll most commonly have heard the term in relation to food banks in the UK, but also a range of other food aid provisions such as food pantries, soup kitchens and other community organisations that are offering food in the form of charitable food. So what I want to do today is I want us to think about why the rise of charitable food in the UK can be a problem, and also go through some of the reasons why charitable food aid has become so permanent and endemic in the UK, and then also think about alternatives to charitable food aid. So thinking about how we can move away from a model that is based on charity to one that is based on social justice and rights. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I just want to begin by giving a brief context to the growth and reach of charitable food aid in the UK. And also I want to really flag how the COVID-19 context has exacerbated and worsened the rise of charitable food aid. Then I'm going to talk a bit more about my own ethnographic work on food banks and how this has developed to now be looking at food banks on a broader scale, looking towards international work in the US and Canada. So finally, I'll talk about why it's important to think about rights, not charity, and why that matters, and thinking as well about how we need to include the experiences and voices of those who are receiving charitable food aid, but also people who are at the front line providing these services. So compared to this time 5 years ago, the need for food banks in the Trussell Trust network has increased by 81%. So the Trussell Trust are the UK's largest food bank franchise. It's a Christian charity, and since 2010 they've seen a real huge increase in the amount of food parcels that have been given out by the Trussell Trust. So you can see here on the slide that really around that 2020-21 period, when we were in that first year of the pandemic, there were over 2.5 million food parcels that were given out from the Trussell Trust. And so the Trussell Trust provide food parcels that are 3 days of food for people who are needing to access that emergency food in a time of crisis. And as well as the Trussell Trust, there's also many independent food banks across the UK. And as of since December 2019, we've actually now got more food banks in the UK than branches of McDonalds. So we can see that there's a huge scale for food banks in the UK, and really how that's increased as we've seen, a decade of austerity measures, but then also the impact that the pandemic's had. And then now we're in a position where the cost of living crisis is likely going to exacerbate and intensify this situation even more. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to think about how COVID-19 has exacerbated the need for charitable food in the UK, but also elsewhere. So we know that the pandemic has really exposed food injustices and food inequalities in the so-called global north. So in these rich but unequal countries such as the UK and Europe and North America. But this has been particularly a problem for people who are in marginalised communities. So in the UK, we know that independent food banks saw real unprecedented increases of the need for emergency food parcels from that first year of the pandemic, 2020. And we know that this is continuing now as a result of the cost of living crisis. And some food banks are reporting not having enough food, not having enough volunteers, not being able to meet the huge increase in demand that food banks across the country are now seeing. And so we know that UK inflation figures now have actually hit 10% a couple of weeks ago. So we've seen that independent food banks in particular are really struggling to cope with the demand for their services. And this is having a knock-on impact for all charitable food aid across the UK. And again, this is highlighting some of the problems in a reliance on charitable food aid to be providing the very basic needs of people, such as food, in the absence of proper social security protections from the government. So another issue that we've seen as charitable food aid has risen following COVID-19 is a rise of corporate involvement from companies and businesses, but also direct funding from governments to fund charitable food and food banks. So there are several problems with this. So we know that these increased funds are trying to respond to the problem of increased food insecurity and poverty, but actually we know that people who are using food banks and experiencing food insecurity, it's showing that this is a symptom of some deeper problems, some more underlying structural issues. So increasing the funds to food charities doesn't actually start to address those underlying problems. The reason people are needing to use food banks and access charitable food in the first place is because of a lack of income, whether that be from employment or from social security provision provided by the government. Ultimately, people are accessing food banks because they don't have the money to buy food that they need for themselves and their families. So while emergency efforts from food banks, can feed people for the moment, they don't address the reasons that people are actually seeking services in the first place. So I think what the pandemic has really shown us is that it is really clear that we can't food bank our way out of persistent food insecurity. There need to be wider structural responses that focus on the underlying and deep-seated problems of poverty overall. So I just want to talk a little bit more now about my own work for the past 9 years that has focused on food bank use in the UK and now internationally. But in 2013, I began undertaking ethnographic research in a Trussell Trust food bank in Stockton-on-Tees in North East England. So when I talk about ethnographic research, basically that means I became part of the Trussell Trust. I became a volunteer as well as a researcher because I really wanted to understand, how a food bank can work, what it looks like, who uses them, and what it's like for people having to come and ask for emergency food. So I spent about 7 years volunteering in the Trussell Trust Food Bank in Stockton, but my book Hunger Pains here was based on 18 months as in my dual role as a volunteer and a researcher. So my research found that food bank use was linked to multiple factors, but mainly related to issues around inadequate social security benefits and ultimately low income. So there were several reasons and often sort of overlapping multiple reasons why people were actually accessing food banks in the first place. But something that stood out was the health implications of food bank use. So I saw that food bank use and provision that's offered through a food bank can actually be unsuitable even in the short term for people, particularly if they've got existing health conditions. Often the food that's provided from a food bank it's processed food, it's prepackaged food, it's, ambient goods such as tins and processed foods. So if you've got a particular health concern such as, irritable bowel syndrome or a particular deficiency, sometimes the food that's provided from a food bank isn't actually addressing, those particular dietary needs. I think importantly as well, a clear finding from my own work and that of others' work is that people who are using food banks often experience stigma, shame and embarrassment. So very much food banks are seen as a last resort. People would draw on, other sources of support such as from friends and family, spending any savings that they might have before they would actually access a food bank. And this is very much linked to ideas around deservingness. So the idea that people who are using food banks in some way have to be, there are sort of judgments being made by, for example, wider political discourse with MPs saying that, people only use food banks because they're unable to budget or, they're doing it because it's free and it's there. And I think also this fits into sort of wider media, public discourse around who should be using food banks. And so some of these issues around, gratitude and sort of who is genuine and why they're using a food bank in the first place all come together to really feed into that experience of being potentially stigmatising and having that embarrassment linked to to what it's like to actually use a food bank. So I want to spend some time now thinking, well, why is it a problem then for charitable food aid to exist? On the surface, it seems like it's a helpful and necessary response to food insecurity and poverty. It's something that, we see probably every day of our lives. If we go into the supermarket, we see food donation points. If we go to football matches, there are fans outside collecting tins for the food bank. Food banks are now something that are so visible in society, they've almost become an acceptable choice. But actually, why is it a problem for charitable food aid to exist in the first place? So as I've just mentioned, that issue of stigma. So there's the stigma that's related to actually accessing a food bank in the first place. But if we unpack that a little bit more, where does the stigma come from? So first of all, if we think about the choice that's involved in accessing the food bank, there is a set list of items that people are given when they access a food bank. What happens if people don't like some of the things that are given in the food parcel? If people then express their own desires or opinions for something else, does that mean that they don't really need food? Or is it actually, thinking that they want to exert some choice and control in the situation? So this is very much linked into these ideas of stigma and what's expected of people when they access a food bank. Again, the idea of gratitude. So academics have looked into this issue as well around, how people using food banks are expected often to express gratitude and be thankful of the food that they're receiving. And if they don't, there's again questions over their deservingness or their how genuine they are in the first place. And again, this sort of all leads into these sort of wider narratives of deservingness that are encouraged by members of parliament, by the government, and also how public opinion feeds into this. So it's the idea that there should be a sort of ideal food bank user who, expresses gratitude and is grateful for the food that they're given and will behave in a certain way. So secondly, if we think about the idea of conditionality, so often, and especially with Trussell Trust food banks, people can't just turn up to a food bank and access food. They first of all have to meet certain criteria and access a voucher, which they then exchange for 3 days worth of food. So again, if we think of how this can be tied into deservingness, not everybody can access food banks. Thirdly, if we think about ethics and morality, so in that charity relationship, there's always going to be that power imbalance. So you've got volunteers who are providing food, but then people who are actually having to go and ask for food in the first place. You can already see there's that clear imbalance there. And so Pat Kaplan in her work on food banks has written about the gift relationship. So again, in that relationship, think about how gratitude, choice and morality, how they all tie into that relationship. And we can see that charity is not then given to social equals and why that is problematic. And finally, charitable food aid, if it continues to exist, and like I mentioned earlier, it isn't actually tackling those underlying structural issues. So Graham Richards has written about how the social construction of hunger as a matter for charity depoliticises food poverty. So it takes the politics out of it and absolves government of their responsibility to provide for citizens. So in my own work, my ethnographic work in Stockton in 2013 has then developed as I started to see that in the UK we were continually having further institutionalisation of food banks, this further permanence of food banks. And this echoes wider patterns that we've seen in North America. For example, in the US, food banks have been in existence since the 1960s, and then in Canada since the 1980s. And again, what were meant to be very, very much temporary, emergency, acute measures have then had a much longer and much more embedded history. What can countries that have got a much longer history of charitable food bank use, such as the US and Canada, what can they learn from us in the UK? But also what can the UK learn from those countries that have got that much longer history of provision? So that's led to my work now, and for the last 4 years, working with a group of activists, frontline organisations, academics and people with lived experience in the US, Canada and the UK who've come together to form the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health and Social Justice, and working towards the idea of rights and not charity. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about this work and why it's important to think about how we can move from a place of charitable food aid towards ensuring that people's rights are respected and people can access food in a dignified manner. So one of the most striking and notable differences that we've seen in more recent years is the rise of corporate partnerships and the funding of charitable food aid. So you'll see on the screen there's some of the partners that have been supporting and funding some of the work that food banks are doing. And this is problematic in several ways. So for example, some of the companies here on the screen, they don't actually offer social protections for their employees in the first place, so they might not be paying living wages, for example. So some of the companies that we see on this screen, it's problematic in their funding of food banks and charitable food aid because in the first place, they aren't actually protecting the social protections of their employees. So we've seen articles over the years that show that even though these companies are funding food banks, some of their employees are having to actually access food banks themselves because of a lack of decent wages or a lack of proper contract rights. So this is really problematic if we think that companies are propping up a system that is only meant to be addressing temporary food insecurity, but actually in increasing funding for food banks, it's further embedding and further institutionalising this as a system for people to access food. And we know from many years of academic research, but also from the lived experience of what it's like to use a food bank, that having to access food in this way isn't dignified, it isn't a choice, it's something that people do as a last resort. So this increase in corporate partnerships in food banks is problematic for several reasons. So my work with the Global Solidarity Alliance, who, like I say, are an international network of practitioners, academics and activists, but also importantly, it includes people with lived experience of poverty, but also lived experience of working in food banks. And so we've been working together to really think about what is the alternative to the current systems of charitable food in these rich but unequal countries, but also building a shared understanding of how these policies that we've seen that have taken hold in North America have been replicated in the UK, but other European countries and beyond. So we know that it's important to respond to the immediate needs of people living in poverty, but also thinking about those longer term opportunities for structural change. So some of the things we're exploring as a alliance are firstly the relationship between the government and non-profit sector in providing food and other services, but also how to reframe the relationship between corporations, charities and the government to really support and nurture social justice. But also thinking about narrative change and how to best communicate a new vision for this sort of work to the general public and policymakers. So I think when we talk about ending the need for food banks or closing food banks down, we need to really explain to people why the existence of food banks in the first place can be problematic. What is the existence of food banks? What is it hiding? What is it covering up? Really thinking about those really deep-seated structural issues that we need to change and resist. So our common goal as part of the Global Solidarity Alliance is to really challenge and change the wider narrative. So moving away from charity being seen as a solution to hunger and poverty, to understanding those structural causes and shifting policy and practice towards a more equitable and resilient food system. So some of the questions that we ask as part of our alliance are, what examples of income-based public policy alternatives are there to charitable food? So for example, in the UK, the Independent Food Aid Network they've pioneered what they call a cash-first approach, where people can access cash through local welfare assistance. And the idea is that you would access cash first, so that then you can spend that on, the food you choose, before having to actually access that emergency food. So the idea is people can access cash, then, it's sort of getting past those ideas of stigma, of dignity, and of deservingness that can come with having to use charitable food. And secondly, thinking about the relationship between the government and the non-profit sector in providing charitable food. So thinking about the role and reach of corporations and how they should be supporting charitable food, if at all. And finally as well, really thinking about, how we can ensure people who are experiencing poverty and also working in frontline services are able to share their experiences and advocate for change. So just some questions that I want us to think about are, what are there examples of alternatives to charitable food provision? And what can these look like? And thinking about why can it be problematic for corporations to fund food banks in the first place? And is it important that people who are experiencing poverty can share their experiences and advocate for change? So thank you for listening. If you want to find out more about my work, please do get in touch with me on my email address there. And if you'd like to find out more about the GSA, our website's there, and also our Twitter and our Instagram. Thank you for listening.